Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2022 preliminary budget presentation. In this presentation, we're going to take a look at the 2022 budget goals. We're going to take a look at how we're doing 2021 year to date. We're going to take a look at what the preliminary outlook is for 2022. Then we're going to step through the remaining budget calendar and then lay out what the next steps might be moving towards public review and adoption of the 2022 budget. As we do annually, I'd like to lay out some budget goals heading into the process. For this year, we're looking at 4 broad categories, including operations, capital, stormwater, and sanitary sewer. For operations, we're looking to maintain the excellent services that the township currently provides by ensuring our departments have both proper staffing and the equipment needed to do the job. On the capital side, looking to start building in annual capital dollars to replace and maintain existing assets. This is an issue that we've been talking about for several years. We're hoping to move that ball forward. Stormwater, we look to start executing the funding plan that was adopted by the board earlier in 2021. And then with sanitary sewer, have a discussion about that forecast, set rates at the levels needed to meet operational needs. And then start discussing the long-term capital plan / ownership. For the 2021 update, I'm going to hand it off to our finance director, Bob Tate. But generally speaking, the revenues are looking pretty good. The federal stimulus that was approved by the federal government earlier this year certainly helped. And then we've got our fingers crossed for no more surprises for the rest of 21. So take it away, Bob.
Thank you, Bill. Here we're looking at our general fund revenues over the past 5 years in the major categories, which include real estate taxes, business taxes, and all others. Real estate taxes constant. Business taxes, while they do fluctuate, 2021 is showing a nice recovery. And then all other categories of permitting and department earnings. As we look a little deeper into each of these categories in the general fund, we're comparing our full year budget versus our year-to-date actual through August. To do that, we're using a target, which is established based on the last several years, where we, on average, where we would be at this point in the year. So for real estate taxes and business taxes, we are ahead of target, with business taxes performing very well and actually slightly ahead of budget at this point in time. License and permitting, not bad, close to target. The grants, far exceeding target and budget, and largely due to the federal stimulus money. With department earnings and other categories lagging slightly behind, but expected to catch up before the end of the year. And here we take a little closer look at the business taxes, which is primarily 4 categories: our local services tax, mercantile tax, business privilege tax, realty transfer taxes. And looking at how each has performed year to date, January through August, over the past 4 years. Local service tax slightly off, more people from working from home accounts for that. Mercantile tax lagging slightly, as expected, still recovering from the pandemic. Business privilege showing a very nice recovery this year, much of that helped by an increase in our discovery taxes, and realty transfer taxes performing very well, bolstered by a single transaction which included several multi-tenant structures. So here we have a brief overview of our general fund expenditures. These are the major categories of the expenditures. Real quickly, the wages, benefits, payroll taxes, and the transfers. Look at these in the aggregate, because this is essentially all the cost to provide for the services, the staff, the services, and the transfers cover our debt service and the required capital needs for the township to operate. This in the aggregate represents about 75% of the total expense budget. The year-to-date number captured right here is right in line, right about 75% for our year-to-date figure. In the aggregate overall, our target for wages at this point in the year, based on the number of payrolls, would be 65%. We're sitting at 66%. Payroll tax and liabilities, target of 60%. We're at 49%. All expenses in the aggregate looking good at 60%. Back to you, Bill.
Thank you, Bob. Switching gears now, let's start looking forward. So we have a 2022 preliminary forecast. We're going to take a quick second here to step through our revenue assumptions, our expenditure assumptions, what those preliminary forecasts look like, and then what the cash balances of our major funds are looking like as well. So our major revenue assumptions, taking a look forward at 2022, for the preliminary numbers, the real estate millage is remained unchanged or is showing no change. So you'll see the same revenue levels there. Business taxes, we're continuing to show some recovery along with increases in audit revenue as well as discovery activity. All of that being the benefit of having a full-time Act 511 person running that program, which the board approved going into 2021. So we're seeing the benefits of that resource. Permitting activity, we're showing revenues that are getting back to more like pre-COVID levels. Always difficult to predict, but those forecasts and prior to COVID seem to materialize and pan out close to estimates. So that's where we're getting back to. Sanitary sewer rates, we're showing in this preliminary budget those rates being unchanged. You'll see a significant deficit in that fund, so we're anticipating that later versions will need to show a rate increase to generate the revenue needed to operate. And then finally, the stormwater fee remains unchanged as part of the funding plan approved by the board. So that rate is anticipated to stay the same while we start moving those projects and the borrowing forward. On the expenditure side, some of the major assumptions included in this preliminary budget are that a $1.3 million transfer for departmental capital. That amount in the aggregate is similar to funding levels from prior years to keep the 5-year capital plan moving forward. And again, going back to making sure that the departments have the equipment they need to deliver those services that we ask them to deliver. With regard to OPEB, it is not included in these preliminary numbers. We expect CARFAC to be delivering their report and recommendation to the board here shortly this fall. And then based on the direction the board wants to go, we'll incorporate those numbers at that time. For the community organizations, we included those funding levels at the same amount as 2021 as a placeholder, understanding that or anticipating that we'll have further discussion and that those amounts might change. But given that they are significant to the expense side of our ledger, we wanted to make sure they were at least included in the preliminary numbers, so we have a good idea where the total expenses are. But again, those are at 2021 levels as a placeholder, knowing that that'll probably change. Then finally, in terms of staffing, which is more than 50% of our operating costs, for these preliminary numbers, they're at the same staffing levels for all departments as they are today. So no additional staffing amounts are included. We anticipate having those discussions going forward as well. Bob, why don't you show us the numbers? Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. So here presented is our general fund operating statement and a look at our 2022 preliminary budget. And it helps to show some history for context. You'll notice that the revenue numbers, these major categories, are presented as they're in brackets or presented as negative numbers, with the expenses as positive numbers. So the bottom line, the delta or the variance, this is a favorable variance at this point, with revenues slightly exceeding total expenses for the year. To arrive at this, the assumptions that we've included in this budget, real estate tax, no change in millage for 2022. Our Act 511 taxes, business taxes, we're continuing to budget and anticipate some continued recovery here. License and permits, still a very conservative projection as we slowly return to some of our pre-COVID activity. Not as high as it was back in 18 and 19. So I think a healthy conservative estimate for 2022. And our grants, we're including the second installment of the federal stimulus money coming in 2022. On the expense side, we're staffing levels the same, and operations service levels same or similar in prior years. And our community organization number, this is a number to be discussed, but these as a placeholder, as mentioned by Bill, this is consistent with prior years. All in all, we're coming in with a favorable variance at this point of $56,411. In our sanitary sewer operating statement, again, similar format as in the previous slide, prior years presented, our 2022 budget based on a revenue that is based on the current rate that's in force today. So assuming no increase in the sewer rate for next year, these are the revenue projections. Expenses consistent with prior years in terms of service levels, and here we're showing a significant reduction in any new moving capital, holding the line there. The RHM number is consistent with prior years. This one exception, typically in the fourth quarter of each year, we receive a credit against our fourth quarter payment. That credit did not occur in 2020, which these are the full gross amount quarterly payments. We did receive that credit in 2021. So all in all, the sewer fund still showing, with reduced capital, we're still showing a significant deficit of approximately $675,000. And in our stormwater fund 2022 budget, preliminarily, we have revenue estimated at the rate currently in place as established by the township. Will provide just over $1 million in revenue. What's different for 2022 is we're showing revenue of $6.3 million. This is the debt proceeds to finance the capital plan as approved by the board, offset by the CapEx improvements down here of $6.3 million. The preliminary budget shows a favorable variance or increase in fund balance of $467,500 for 2022. So to wrap up, as part of the budgeting process, we take a look at the ending fund balance year over year. And we check that against our fund balance policy as established by the Board of Commissioners many years ago. Thanks to having that policy and having healthy cash reserves, it allowed the township to weather the storm of the pandemic in 2020 and then pass a budget in 2021, allowing the township to utilize some of those reserves to fund the operations and continue to provide the same level of superior services to the residents of the township. But as we look forward and we see the decrease in the cash balances, we are out of compliance with the fund balance policy, and based on the 2022 preliminary budget, we will continue to be out of compliance by approximately $2.1 million. With that said, we look forward to working with the board. Since this will be the second straight year we'll be short, that we want to work with the board to incorporate a correction or a plan of action to help bring it back up, to restore those fund balances and establish those healthy cash reserves for the future. As we look at the sanitary sewer fund, we do have a significant deficit in net expense. We'll need to discuss adjustments in the fee to cover our operating costs in the sanitary sewer fund. And the stormwater fund continues to maintain a healthy fund balance. It's performing as expected as the funds are utilized and projects are planned and approved by the board for stormwater mitigation. Thank you. Over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Bob. Now let's take a look at the budget calendar. At the request of the board in prior years, understanding that we were always getting jammed up toward the end of the budget cycle with the end of the year looming and our obligation to get a budget passed, we started this program a couple months earlier this year. Departments developed their budgets in July, which normally didn't start until the end of October in prior cycles. So by the end of July, early August, we had departmental budgets pretty much prepared. Finance worked with those departments to finalize capital, as well as prepare the preliminary budget document that we are presenting numbers on as part of this presentation. Then in August, here in September, we continue our internal departmental meetings to refine the numbers and incorporate any requests that we have going forward. We're also working with the board to schedule public meetings for presentations and reviews of the major topics, which we anticipate having either later in September or October. And then in November, we're hoping to introduce and adopt the budget. Again, that'll be a little bit ahead of schedule than prior years. We're not up against the last meeting of the year in December to get it done, so we incorporated a calendar that allows us to get it done in November. We always have those meetings in December if needed, but the hope is that we have this buttoned up in October or in November this year. As we transition from a preliminary budget standpoint to the budget that's going to include the township manager's recommendations, I wanted to key up a few long-term sustainability issues that are not new to our budget discussions, but I wanted to make sure they were highlighted. As we look at financial sustainability, we talk about our reliance on business taxes, and as we've seen with COVID and in prior recessionary periods, just how much those can fluctuate year over year and what kind of impact that has to our operations. Part of our discussion I'd like to be is to take a look at more reliable revenues and matching those up with planned long-term expenditures and making sure that we have ample reserves. As discussed on the capital side, making sure we have sustained annual funding to replace our aging and existing assets. We have great infrastructure throughout this town in our various areas, but we need to fund for their replacement on a regular basis. Ultimately, then on the community organization, again, that's long-term planning, coming up with an allocation method that the board can approve and that we can plan on going forward to ensure that, from the township's perspective, we have the money needed to fund these organizations, and from the organization's perspective, they can reasonably rely on something from the township if the board so chooses. And then ultimately, staffing and programming, making sure that we have the staffing need or this adequate staffing to deliver the services that are being asked of by the township. So in order to get us from where we are today to hopefully a budget document that we're ready to adopt in November, I'm recommending that we schedule some special meetings to cover some of these specific topics. Probably one needed to talk about our community organization funding, hear from those organizations, identify the levels of funding, and talk about any kind of long-term methodology or program that we can count on in future years to fund those organizations. Then, as mentioned on the capital side, developing a program that generates or provides for the revenues needed to replace existing assets in our township. Right now, there is no funding to replace existing assets. We periodically borrow for the replacement and/or expansion of assets, but what we've advocated for in the past is more of a scheduled, reliable revenue source to make sure those assets are being replaced as needed. And then ultimately, or finally, a discussion on staffing and other board priorities to make sure that the 2022 budget and future budgets include the resources or the dollars needed to make sure that board priorities and/or staffing needs are addressed. So we'll be working with the board to get those scheduled. And with that, I would like to thank you for watching. Hopefully this recorded method of presentation works. It's a way to get this out quickly to not only the Board of Commissioners, but to the public. We appreciate you watching this, and we look forward to continuing these discussions going forward. Until then, take care.